Hello friends, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about ecosystem as well as energy cycles including geochemical energy cycle, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, food chain, food web and ecological pyramid.
So we need to know exactly what ecosystem is all about. It is when the organisms, whether plants, animals, microorganisms, human beings, they interact with the physical environment in which they live in. So this interaction is called as an ecosystem, which includes both biotic as well as abiotic components when they are linked together.
So primarily the source of energy is the solar energy which enters into the system in the process of photosynthesis and is incorporated into the plant tissues. So, by feeding on these plants or eating these plants by the animals, they play an important role in the movement and the flow of energy from one organism to the other organism in the system. So, when all these organisms they die, the carbon in them is broken down by the decomposers. The decomposers break down the dead organic matter and release carbon back into the atmosphere and also facilitates the nutrient cycle to continue in the environment by converting the nutrients stored in the dead biomass or organisms back to a form that can be again used by plants and microbes. So, energy flows in the system in the form of chemical energy, which is the main source of energy which is required by all living organisms. And this flow is called as energy flow. So, the energy is transferred to different trophic levels along the food chain. Energy flowing in this ecosystem is basically the transference or the movement of energy from one trophic level to another trophic level in the ecosystem. So, the energy is passed down from one organism to another organism in the form of chemical energy. So basically what happens is the all the organisms which are there in the ecosystem or in the environment can be organized into sections in the food chain, and these sections or these levels in the food chain is called as trophic levels. So energy is flowed from the autotrophs to the consumers and heterotrophs as well as to the decomposers and finally back to the environment. So the energy which is transferred from one trophic level to another trophic level through the organisms, they follow the laws of thermodynamics. What are the laws of thermodynamics? The first law says that energy can neither be created nor it can be destroyed. It can be transferred from one organism or one form to another form. It can change its form, but it cannot be created or destroyed. It remains in the environment as it is. The second law of thermodynamics says that when energy is passed from one body to another body, the more organisms that it passes through, more and more energy is consumed, and finally it is wasted till the energy is finally consumed or depleted completely. So it keeps on moving from one body to another body, from one form to another form, till it is completely depleted. So, because of this energy flow, life is possible on this earth. It is important for the survival of different kinds of organisms, from microorganisms to flora, fauna, human beings, other animals to live on this planet, because there is a flow of energy. And primary source of energy is the solar energy. We only receive less than 50% of the incoming solar radiation, and that percentage that we absorb is called as effective radiation. So most of the sun's radiation that falls on the earth's surface is again reflected back into the space or in the earth's atmosphere at night. That is called as terrestrial radiation. But photosynthetically active radiation is around 40 to 50% of the energy which falls on the surface of the earth, which is received by the earth. In this photosynthetically active radiation, only 2 to 10% is absorbed by the plants by photosynthesis. Thus, the energy which is flowing in the ecosystem or the energy which is absorbed because of the solar radiation which is falling on the surface, only that part which is absorbed is again transferred to another form of energy or another organism. That takes place via the food chain or the food web. So plants are the producers of energy. They absorb the sunlight, and with the help of chloroplast, what do is they transform that energy into chemical energy. The solar radiation energy is transferred and converted into chemical energy in the form and in the process of photosynthesis. So basically, the autotrophs are the organisms or the plants, the green plants that grow and develop their bodies and produce organic matter through inorganic substances. For that, they require carbon dioxide and they require minerals, soil, water, and various other kinds of gases. And this chemical reaction requires the energy which is from the sun, and the process is called as photosynthesis. So basically, a small amount comes from bioelectrogenesis in wetlands also, like the algae. They also produce their own food. So all the organisms which are green in color, which contains chloroplast, they produce or manufacture their own food, and therefore they are called as autotrophs. But heterotrophs are another trophic level of ecosystem in which there are some organisms which cannot manufacture their own food. They are not green in color, they do not have chloroplast. They feed on other plants and other animals for their energy requirements or to provide them with nutrients so that they can survive. They are called as heterotrophs. Hetero in Greek word means others, and troph means nourishment. So they get the nourishment from other sources of energy. So these heterotrophs are consumers. They cannot manufacture their own food, but they can consume and they obtain their nourishment from other organisms like human beings, goat, sheep, other animals. Now there are four types of heterotrophs. They are namely holozoic, saprophytic, parasitic, and symbiotic. So I'll just briefly describe what are the different types of heterotrophs. The first is holozoic. Holozoic heterotrophs are the ones which take in the food in the form of solid or liquid, and through the bodily functions they ingest that food or they digest the food, and there are some fluids which are present in the body which enables them to digest and break down the food into smaller particles and then produce nourishment. Human beings also come in this category. Then there are other protozoas like amoeba which also ingest the food and take the nourishment, so that is called as holozoic. So, saprophytic heterotrophs are the ones which obtain their food by absorbing the dissolved organic matter. In simple words, they obtain their food from breaking down the dead and the decayed organic matter. So, they feed on the dead and the decayed. The parasitic organisms, they have got very close relationship between other species as well, and inside them they grow or live in other organisms and they obtain their nutrients from other organisms. So what does the parasite do? Basically they obtain all the nutrients from the other organism. They may harm the other organism on which they live in, so they grow in that organism and slowly they eat up that organism, and this is how they survive. So the wider interpretation is symbiosis. Symbiotics are the ones which depend upon other biological species. So they can be parasites also, or they can be more helpful also to the other species. Symbiotics means they mutually depend upon each other and they benefit each other. Like for example, the bees depend upon flowers, they obtain nectar from there, from which they make honey. And in return, they also help the flowers and the plants to pollinate. So last in this cycle comes the decomposers. The decomposers, which are like fungi, bacteria, viruses, invertebrates. Invertebrates are those animals which do not have any backbone, like worms, insects, and they have the ability to break down the dead organisms. So any animal, human beings, when they are dead, they are broken down, they are decomposed by these decomposers. So the dead organisms are broken into smaller particles and they create new compounds. So they restore the natural nutrient cycle, helping in the composting. So, any dead organism is composted or decomposed because of these decomposers. All the chemical reaction which takes place, they basically help in the decaying of the dead bodies. So, this is the ecological cycle which we are talking about, from the autotrophs which generate their food, from the abiotic components to the heterotrophs and to the decomposers. Now, I'm going to talk about the ecological pyramid, which also shows the same kind of relationship between one organism and the other organism in the ecosystem. But this pyramid is in a graphical representation. In a graphical representation, it shows all the living organisms which are there in different trophic levels. It is developed by Raymond Linderman and Evelyn Hutchinson on the idea of the pyramid of energy or productivity. So this diagram is in a pyramidal shape, and at the bottom you will see is the first trophic level, which consists of the producers. The producers are those beings or organisms which manufacture their own food by obtaining the energy from the sun and the minerals and the water as well as the gases. So they are the autotrophs which produce or manufacture their own food. So, in the next two levels, we have the secondary consumers as well as the tertiary consumers. They depend upon the autotrophs or the plants for the food or for the nutrients. So, they obtain their food by consuming the autotrophs. So, they are basically heterotrophs. I have already told you the different types of heterotrophs. And in the end comes the decomposers like the vultures, the eagles, which feed on the dead, and they help in the decomposition like fungi and bacteria. They help in producing compost and decomposing the dead bodies and help in completing the cycle of the nutrition or the nutrient cycle. Next, we are going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. So, nitrogen is the most abundant gas which is present in the atmosphere. About 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but it is of no use to human beings or to the plants. It is in the unusable form. So, nitrogen also has its own cycle, like we have the food cycle. Similarly, we also have nitrogen cycle, where nitrogen is used by the living organisms and then again helps in decomposition of living organisms and goes back into the atmosphere. So, it's like a cycle from the atmosphere to the soil to the organisms back to the atmosphere. Human beings artificially also add nitrogen into the soil, into the atmosphere, into the natural environment, and that can be very harmful for the human health as well as the natural environment. So, artificially, like for example, when they burn fossil fuels and combustion, artificial nitrogen fertilizers also add nitrogen into the soil. So, in a way, it is very harmful for the health as well as for the environment and the ecosystem. It's not a natural way to add nitrogen into the soil, they are doing it forcefully. So, in a way, it is not natural nitrogen gas which is added to the atmosphere or to the ecosystem. So, that is causing a lot of pollution. So, the natural way of converting the inert gas, which is nitrogen, which is present in the inert form or inactive form in the atmosphere, into usable form is by converting it into NH3 or ammonia. And how do we do that? That is done naturally. This is done by some bacteria which are called as symbiotic bacteria, and they're specially called as diazotrophs. So, diazotrophs are those bacteria or symbiotic bacteria which enable the nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere to convert into more usable form. So, these bacteria consist of some enzymes, and through these enzymes, they have the ability to convert or to combine the gaseous nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere into hydrogen, and they basically combine the nitrogen with hydrogen to form ammonia. So they form from N2, they create NH3 which is ammonia. Another way of nitrogen fixation is by lightning. Lightning, what does it do is that it breaks the nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere into nitrogen oxides because of the high pressure and because of the high intensity. And this nitrogen oxide is then used by the plants and then used in the ecosystem. Another way of nitrogen fixation is biologically done, like the bacteria, which are called as rhizobiums, which are in the form of blue green algae, which you find in ponds and in still water. They transform the unusable form of nitrogen into other forms which can be used, or into compounds which can be used by other living organisms. So, this is also another way of nitrogen fixation. So, through nitrogen fixation, the nitrogen which is in the unusable form in the atmosphere is converted into nitrites, ammonia, nitrates, and this is released into the soil, which enriches the soil, which fertilizes the soil. So, this basically enables us to cultivate more crops. So, this is the nutrients which are added to the soil, which is used mainly for cultivation. So, a similar kind of process also takes place in the marine ecosystem, in the oceans. So, nitrogen is also fixated in the ocean. How? Nitrogen, which is containing all the compounds from the atmosphere when they fall into the ocean as sediments, okay, they get compressed over thousands and hundreds of long years, and then they form sedimentary rocks. So basically all the sediments which get collected in the ocean, they form sedimentary rocks. But due to geological upliftment, they come to the surface, they reach the surface, and then they are released into the plants as the rocks get weathered and eroded over the time period. So, ammonification. This is a process when the bacteria they absorb the ammonia which is present in the soil, and they help in decomposing of plants and animal matter when they die. So it helps in cleaning of the atmosphere and the environment, and again adding the same nitrogen into the atmosphere back. So it's like a cycle. So there are microbes, which are microscopic organisms which harvest energy in order to accumulate nitrogen in the form which is required for the growth. Now, nitrogenous wastes like animal urine, they are also broken down by nitrifying bacteria, by these bacteria which are present in the soil, and it is used again by the plants. So this is like a cycle. When the atmospheric nitrogen is converted into nitrates and nitrites used by the plants, then again the organisms, when they die, they are again decomposed by, because of the ammonia which has been prepared by nitrogen fixation, and also the microbes enable the plants again to absorb the nitrogen from the soil. So this is a kind of a process which is continuous in the environment, and it is also important for the natural functioning of the ecosystem.